In this video, I'm going to take you through my answer to the 2020 Unseen Poetry question. If you've seen my previous video, you're well on the way to understanding what's coming up. If you haven't, here are my notes on the poem that we're studying. I'm going to freeze the screen in a minute and put this there for you in case you want to read it first. And if you don't worry, go straight into the essay. Coming now. Here's the question, the poem, and my notes, should you want them. On with the video. To make it easier for the examiner and for me, I start my essay by answering the question directly. So the poem begins ambiguously so that we're not entirely certain what the speaker feels about love. The poet probably intends us to be slightly troubled by the speaker's offering of a poem as a symbol of love. So that's reasonably detailed, and why I've done that is it helps me as my essay plan. This is what I'm going to prove in my poem. It also shows that I'm writing an argument. I'm developing ideas throughout the essay that are going to prove these two big ideas I've outlined. A third thing that you might have noticed is that the question asked me to write about the speaker, but I'm showing the examiner that I know the poet could be entirely different from the speaker. In other words, the speaker is a construct to illustrate the poet's ideas. Now, if we zoom into some examiner speak, you'll see why that's so important. At the top of the level, a candidate's response is likely to be a critical, exploratory, well-structured argument. Now, what's critical and what's exploratory we might argue about, but outlining two things that I'm going to prove at the beginning of the essay clearly shows the examiner, hey, this is going to be a top argument. I have colour-coded two things for you as we go through the essay. In green, you will find the methods that the poet's using, and in yellow you'll find the quotations, and I just want you to get a sense of how the quotations are integrated into the sentences. That's called embedding quotations, but also how many quotations I use in order to prove my argument. And then as we move through, you'll see how I zoom in on particular words within quotations to show I'm being exploratory. Right, let's start with our first method. The justification, since I have nothing else to give, suggests that the speaker may be financially poor, but also that they value words more than actions. So this is a neat little trick, giving a quotation and then two possible explanations afterwards. Having two explanations, well, that must be exploratory, mustn't it? The simile instructing the lover to receive the poem and keep it like a warm coat when winter comes to cover you invites us to wonder if the lover feels unloved, and that winter is not just a metaphor for life's struggles, but for the troubles caused by the speaker's lack of physical presence or commitment. So here you'll notice I've got three explanations for my quotation. So that's number one, that's number two, and that's number three. Don't worry if you don't get to three, but if you always try to get to two, you'll be in the top band. You may be thinking to yourself, Mr. Salles, you're using a simile and a metaphor. Okay, I can see that those are methods or techniques, but what about justification? Well, if we jump over to AO2, the examiner is looking for analysis of writers' methods with subject terminology used judiciously. But what is a method? If I asked you what your method was for brushing your teeth, you would just tell me all the things that you did. If I asked you what your method was for getting to school in the morning, you'd tell me how you got to school. There isn't like a secret list of words that means methods. What there is these are the things that I do or did. And so when we jump into the poem, methods means what is the poet doing? The poet is including a justification. And yes, they're also including a simile and also including a metaphor. If we jump down to the next paragraph, you'll see that the poet is using some repetition and they're doing something structural. They're putting it after each stanza. So methods are not just language features. Let's read. To counter this, the speaker repeats I love you after each stanza and at the end of the poem. This implies that the speaker feels love needs to be continually demonstrated. It implies the speaker feels a lover needs constant reassurance, and love appears to create a state of constant anxiety. So now you'll notice another three-part explanation. This is my first part. This is my second. This is my third. This is also mimicked in the speaker, who begins the poem offering this poem. The verb choice offering rather than giving implies that the lover feels he or she might be easily rejected. Okay, let's delve into this a bit. Being able to zoom in on single words is a useful skill. Notice that my method here isn't just the writer is using a verb, because all writers use verbs all the time. It would be like saying he went walking by using his legs, like it's obvious. But there is something significant about the way this verb is being used. Giving makes complete sense, but offering implies something subtly different, that it might be rejected. The next paragraph. The speaker continually describes love and the poem as a cure for coldness, which becomes an extended metaphor of love, as a pot full of yellow corn to warm your belly in winter. The reference to belly and the repetition that the lover has nothing else to give implies that being without love is like living a cold and impoverished life. The yellow corn is a symbol of warmth and perhaps hope offered by love. So this is a method continually describing, because it is a pattern I've noticed. And then as I'm writing, I'm thinking, oh, hang on, that's an extended metaphor. So that's another method. I'll write that in. Then I have a really long quotation and I'm thinking, oh, I need to analyze that. So the easiest thing to do is jump onto individual word analysis. So I'm going to write about belly and then yellow corn. And zooming in on individual words helps me offer 2 explanations. Let's read the next paragraph. The third stanza. Notice how easy I've made this essay for myself. I'm just writing about each stanza one at a time. Now, of course, you don't have to write about every stanza because you're up against a time limit, but working your way through in a sequence will help you structure your essay really simply. The third stanza continues this metaphor of love as a bringer of warmth. However, the speaker imagines love as an antidote to the experiences of adult life, which they describe as the wilderness life becomes when mature. Perhaps they see love as the last remaining residue of childhood innocence, in contrast to the lonely and isolating experience of adulthood. So the examiner knows that I think this quotation is a metaphor. We have 2 explanations again. One comes before my quotation and the other one comes after it. And I should at this stage point out that I'm helping the examiner see that I'm being exploratory in another way. I'm using vocabulary like however and perhaps, which show there's an alternative point of view. Let's read the next paragraph. The final stanza is hyperbolic, which means over-exaggerated. Not simply pointing to the warmth and protection and hope that love offers, but suggesting that love is the only nourishment a person needs. It is all anyone needs to live. This is a contrast to the outside world, which no longer cares if you live or die. We are unsure if this is how the lover views the adult world we all inhabit, or if they are writing to a specific lover who feels themselves to be worthless in the eyes of society when no one cares if you live or die. And saying that we can't actually decide for certain is another way that I'm being exploratory. It could be this, or it could be that. Now your conclusion should say, well, okay, I've weighed this up, but I'm going mostly for this or mostly for that. The poem ends with an instruction. Remember, I love you. Now, always have a paragraph about the end of the poem, especially if you're running out of time, because when you write about the end of the poem, you're showing you've understood the journey the poem has taken us on. You're telling the examiner you've understood the whole poem in its entirety, and that makes it a well-structured argument. So wherever you are in your time limit, never forget to write a conclusion which looks at the ending of the poem. The poem ends with an instruction, remember I love you, which returns us to the ambiguity at the beginning of the poem, because it implies that the speaker is not physically present. Now, does this technique of referring back to the beginning of the poem always work? Yes, because that's how any text, especially poems, are constructed. At the end of the poem, the poet always gives us a new perspective on something that was in at the beginning of the poem. So this technique of returning to the beginning has to be in your conclusion every single time you write about a poem. Now, here I have my first explanation. Now I'm going to have a second. And that the lover has to remember the speaker's love by referring to the poem rather than the speaker's physical presence and commitment. The final I love you might ring a little hollow. Might is an exploratory word. Because the recipient of the poem may well not think that love expressed in a poem is enough. Viewers often ask me, Miss Salles, how many paragraphs do I have to write? So I'm going to give you that answer. The answer is going to be 5, but let me explain 2 things. The examiner doesn't care how many paragraphs you write. They just want you to write a new paragraph every time you introduce a new point. Always write a paragraph about the beginning of the poem. Always write a paragraph about the end of the poem. That will be your conclusion. So that's 2 paragraphs. In the middle, you always have to write about 3 different methods, or more if you've got time. You will see from the pattern of green that I often have more than one method in a paragraph. So write about as many methods as you can. It's easier then to say how many quotations do you need to zoom in on, and my answer is always at least 3. So you could ditch one of these paragraphs and still get a grade 9. So hopefully you're watching your time limit in the exam and you get to this 3rd paragraph, you've written it, and then you think, right, do I now have to jump straight into my conclusion, or do I have time to write another paragraph? That's your answer. These are the 15 things that I have taught you in this video. Go back if you're not sure about any of them, pause the screen to check, or you might want to read a student grade 9 answer. That is the video coming up in the corner of your screen, or my screen, our screens. We all screen. Hurrah!